Crown Court is usually where the more serious cases of criminal offending are tried. Accordingly, in the drama series Crown Court, which ran from 1972 to 1984, and which was hailed as a hard-hitting and disturbingly realistic portrayal of the trial process at the Crown Court, proceedings are markedly serious and solemn. So, God only knows how everyone, from the jury to the prosecutor, in the episode entitled The Silencer, manages not to burst out laughing when the judge makes the following comments to defence counsel Mr. Carrigan, who is in the middle of a meaningless and laboured point intended to discredit a witness.
Mr. Carrigan, I think you've gone quite far enough in that direction, don't you?
As you wish, sir.
And in view of the fact that you apparently find it necessary to consult your instructing solicitor about almost every question you ask, I would willingly grant you a short adjournment that you might learn the details of your client's case.
Being put down so sarcastically and so publicly and in the course of such a serious undertaking is bound to trigger an angry comeback from a person, isn't it? So, from Mr. Carrigan, we can expect some sort of bitchy retort, even if it has to be masked in some way, given the occasion concerned. Right? Ha! Wrong. And Mr. Carrigan's timid, impervious response just earns him even more bitchiness from the judge.
I appreciate your concern, sir, but that won't be necessary.
Very good. Well, let's get on then, shall we?
I'd like to return to the morning of the alleged theft.
Limp as a lettuce, Mr. Carrigan takes criticism after criticism from the judge from start to finish without fighting back, including where, in my opinion, his unduly laid-back attitude arguably harms his client's case.
My client was suffering from the effects of tranquilizers, prescribed to her by her family doctor.
Oh, dear.
Sir?
Every time a case of shoplifting comes before me, the defendant appears to be a person who claims to be either drunk, congenitally absent-minded, or whose mind is befuddled with the use of tranquilizers.
Mr. Carrigan ought, in my view, to be deflecting the judge's obvious prejudice here by making it clear to him that what he has to consider at the present time isn't the hundreds of other defendants that he has seen, but the one case of the defendant before him now, whose long-running need for the medication that may have had an important part to play in her alleged criminal act is about to be demonstrated by an expert witness. Defence counsel does no such thing, however.
Well, there are more and more of these drugs being prescribed every year, so perhaps that would explain their involvement in shoplifting. As with alcohol, they could be implicated in other cases as well.
Then again, the judge's irreverent and sarcastic attitude isn't limited to his behaviour towards the defence counsel.
Your Honour, this is the first time I've been called to give evidence at a trial.
There's a first time for everything, Dr. Morton.
I hope I'm right in my belief that I won't be expected to answer questions which would involve revealing confidential information about one of my patients.
You are a witness for the prosecution, Doctor.
I think, sir, in fairness to the witness, I should point out that Dr. Morton has been subpoenaed for the prosecution.
Ah, you did not wish to give evidence at this trial?
No, sir, I did not.
Well,
he then basically tells the doctor to get on with testifying or else.
Well, now that you are here, Doctor, I must point out to you that whatever power to induce silence the Hippocratic oath may have in the groves of academic medicine, it certainly has no such power in this court.
I don't know that getting an actor for the part of the instructing solicitor, whose voice appears to come from the other side of the room, was absolutely essential to this episode.
She wanted to plead guilty and get it over with, but she knew her old man won't let her.
It's ridiculous. The girl's expressing an opinion.
Mr. Truscott.
But in case you need any further convincing of the judge's contempt for the protagonist of this case, although his contempt in the upcoming clip is arguably justified.
Mrs. Truscott's whole life now revolved around her husband, and she felt that without tranquilizers, she could not continue to support him in the way she wished to do. I was left with very little alternative in terms of treating the overall situation.
Oh, really?
Those repeat prescriptions were as much for your benefit as for Mrs. Truscott's.
Yes, all right, Dr. Morton, all right. Mr. Truscott, do not let me have to warn you again about that sort of provocation.
This is a Crown Court case of the theft of a tin of salmon. The judge is clearly dismayed that such a petty case should have reached the Crown Court.
Now, Mrs. Waterman, you are the area security officer for Paradise Supermarkets, are you not?
Yes, sir?
You see, before we get into any further detail, I'm sure the thought going through the minds of the members of the jury is why a case like this, the theft of a small item not worth more than a few shillings, should result in a prosecution.
It was a 7.5 ounce tin of red salmon, sir.
I know that, Mrs. Waterman.
Fancy grade.
cigarette.
The price was £1.16p, not just a few shillings. It is the most common form of shoplifting, the smallest item with the highest price.
Yes, but even so, I'm sure the members of the jury will be wondering why such a large organisation as Paradise Supermarkets should think it worthwhile instituting a prosecution which can only result in expense to themselves and distress to others, out of all proportion to the theft of a small, albeit relatively expensive, tin of salmon.
But that doesn't mean that he can't take every opportunity to indulge his sarcastic humour while presiding over the case.
You have to remember that it's thefts like these, sir, that contribute towards the figure of goods worth £550 million being stolen each year from shops throughout the country.
Quite so, and this must add to the price of the goods in the shop, no doubt.
It increases the housewife's shopping bill by at least twopence in the pound.
2p in the pound.
But it does mean that we can, I believe, understand his acerbic and contemptuous attitude towards the case, and it means that he can, at the trial's conclusion, teach the defendant's legal team an important lesson, as well as teaching us a very interesting lesson, while arguably giving us a sense of satisfaction.
Sir,
Yes, Mr. Carrigan.
the verdict of the jury being in favour of my client, doubtless you will make the usual order that the prosecution should pay my client's costs?
No, Mr. Carrigan. That is the usual order, but this is not the usual case. I am of the opinion that your clients have brought this prosecution upon themselves, and therefore they must pay their own costs.
How does this one piece of laughter that you're about to hear rise above everyone else's, and was it actually scripted? The jury in this drama series was always composed of members of the public, you see, not actors.
In those days, she recalls, Phil used to believe he was the natural successor to Dennis Compton at number 4 for England, even though he was only playing for Fulchester Grammar School Old Boys Second 11.
Of course, the judge is a bit of a trickster. He goes from actually showing the defendant not contempt, but compassion.
Mrs. Truscott?
No, they'll laugh at me again.
Nobody will laugh, I assure you.
No?
No.
To admonishing the jury, in his summing up, not to let their judgment be clouded by sympathy for the defendant, who's called Mrs. Truscott.
And I would remind you, members of the jury, that although there have been moments in this trial which may have seemed to you to be somewhat dramatic, that you must not let such moments, nor any feeling either of anger or pity, influence your considerations.
As we know, deriving an unbiased verdict is a requirement of a criminal trial. The judge was acting as he was bound to. The general consensus is that the judge's voice is extremely sexy and that the judge isn't any too bad looking either.
I wasn't criticising you, Mrs. Waterman, merely seeking some idea of your policy in a matter which might interest the jury. Mr. Carrigan, is your client seriously ill? Pilchards?
Yes, sir.
Not salmon?
No, the salmon was just to the left of the pilchards.
Ah, yes, the red salmon.
Both red and pink, sir.
Yes. My involuntary response to the disturbance we have just witnessed has, of course, resulted in the revelation to the jury and to the court that your instructing solicitor is, in fact, the husband of the defendant. Now, I have so far assumed, Mr. Carrigan, and I trust that I have assumed correctly, that it is not your intention to call Mr. Truscott to give evidence as a witness for the defence.
If you've enjoyed this video, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.